this, we're taking 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 with a pinch of salt.
Dear listeners, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to A Pinch of Salt, a new podcast by the ERA. My name is Andres Kubernet, and I'm your host for this podcast. With us today is Professor Serhan Tuglular. It is an honor to have you with us, Serhan. Welcome to A Pinch of Salt.
Well, thank you, Andres. It's an honor for me to be here.
Okay. I'm really happy that we get to talk about disaster nephrology, which is not always in the forefront of nephrology. Luckily so, maybe, but we need to be prepared. So for those of you who don't know her yet, Professor Tuğlular is a nephrologist from Turkey. She was a council member of the ERA until a couple of months ago, and among other things, she was the chair of a relief task force that was created after the start of the war in Ukraine, primarily to help our colleagues and kidney patients from Ukraine, but which has branched out now afterwards to try and help other areas where kidney patients are involved in disasters. And this is going to be the subject of our talk today. That is disaster nephrology. So Serhan, as a nephrologist from Turkey, you have had a lot of experience with earthquakes, unfortunately, which are a, let's say, prototypical type of renal disaster because of all these potential crush victims. So could you please explain to our listeners why disaster nephrology is needed, why such a task force is needed? What is it about the disasters, either natural or man-made, that make them dangerous to kidney patients and kidneys?
Well, thank you, Andres. I should say patients with across the entire spectrum of kidney diseases, that is those with AKI, acute kidney injury, chronic kidney disease, especially those requiring kidney replacement therapies who are on dialysis or living with a functioning graft, are amongst the most vulnerable at times of disasters and certainly deserve special attention. These patients' survival depend on functioning infrastructure. They need advanced medical technology to, continue the dialysis. They need availability of, specific medications like immunosuppressives in the case of transplant patients, for example, and also well-trained health staff is needed. Now, these special needs can be overlooked by the authorities, especially when there is mass disasters and when the authorities are obviously trying to take care of sheltering problems, food problems, safety problem of the whole general population. These specific needs of these specific patient population can be overlooked. And that's the aim of really starting this kidney relief in disaster task force. The aim of these task forces can be divided into three. One is in the disaster-free period, really. It is being prepared for a disaster when it occurs. And then, of course, at the time of disaster, to understand the extent of the problem and to come up with a plan to mitigate the effects of this disaster, and perhaps afterwards to analyze what has been done, to learn lessons, to learn lessons so that can shed light to perhaps to future disasters. So this patient population is a very vulnerable patient population with specific needs, and that's what we are really advocating for and addressing.
Yeah. I'd just like to maybe offer some numbers from the last earthquake, the Turkey-Syria earthquake of 2023, because when you think about the numbers, the need to actually be prepared becomes much more obvious. So this earthquake presumably affected an area with about 14 million people. And yes, our colleagues from pediatric nephrology and nephrology have gathered the data on pediatric patients. So there were 903 hospitalized children and 189 pediatric patients that needed acute dialysis. Now, if you compare this to the 14 million affected, that would mean about 14 pediatric acute dialysis patients per million people affected. Now, Slovenia, where I come from, is also an earthquake-prone country. We have 2 million of people, and a big earthquake, I'm sure, would affect 1 million. And that would mean then 14 acute pediatric dialysis for us that we would have to do literally in a day or two. And I'm not really completely certain that we're able to do that. So that's the point where you realize that you need to be prepared. So how have you become prepared? How have you developed this contingency plan? Because from what I understand from the last earthquake in Turkey, there wasn't all the patients that needed dialysis were able to get dialysis, which means acute patients and obviously chronic patients where the dialysis centers were perhaps, demolished or destroyed. So how does your plan work? How were you able to make such a plan?
Well, in fact, as you say, Turkey is an earthquake country, and throughout the history, really, there has been many earthquakes which perhaps destroyed many civilizations. One of the major ones was the Marmara earthquake in 1999. Now, at the time, we became, as a Turkish nephrologist, we became aware of the Renal Disaster Relief Task Force of ISN at the time, International Society of Nephrology. And in fact, next day, Raymond van Holder was in Istanbul. And Mehmet Sever, who is now really has been our mentor through all these times, was the local coordinator. The official death toll at that time was 17,500. Now, it was one of the biggest earthquakes of all times, but something good came out of it. First of all, under the, again, leadership of Mehmet Şükrü Sever, data was meticulously collected. At the time, I was doing my residency in nephrology, and we were collecting meticulously all the data, along with treating patients. So this actually led to many publications, many papers, especially about crush syndrome, treatment of crush syndrome, prevention of acute kidney injury in the setting of crush syndrome, which was later transferred even to a guideline. So apart from that, another step was taken was to establish a renal disaster task force within the umbrella of Turkish Society of Nephrology. Now, this task force, very briefly, we divided the country into 17 regions, and 1 or 2 at least nephrologists were appointed as coordinators to each one of these regions, and they were actually nephrologists who are working in the region. And this obviously needed, updating through years because people move from one region to another, and younger people also want to be involved. But this is a well-established task force now, and in disaster-free periods, we organize educational activities towards health staff, nurses, doctors, but also patients, how to detach themselves from dialysis, for example, if the earthquake occurs at the time of dialysis, or what to pick up if they have to miss a couple of dialysis, how to take care of their food, what to eat, what to avoid, etc. So all these are in beforehand. Then, of course, at the time of disasters, as occurred on the 6th of February of last year, in fact, as you have just said, about more than 14 million people was affected. It was one of the biggest earthquakes ever. What really happened was we have already an established network, so we immediately communicated through now WhatsApp. It's much easier, or other groups. social media, but especially we have a dedicated group for this. So we immediately got information from our local friends about the extent of the problem. And we know again from the previous earthquakes that the expected number of crush injury is about 2 to 5% of all injured. So we could actually roughly estimate the amount of dialysis to be needed. And having said that, for earthquakes, we also have learned through the years that it is mainly the first week or 10 days that the dialysis is mostly needed. So we can come up with a logistic planning. Again, one of the plans is, for example, to actually evacuate the in-hospital chronic dialysis patients to the surrounding satellite units so as to provide space for the incoming dialysis patients, the acute cases. So all these were already made plans before. However, during the times of disasters, not everything works according to the plan. First of all, there were also dialysis units having collapsed,
Yes.
satellite dialysis units, and even hospitals. So we needed to reconsider everything, make the plans again. But finally, with an established network, we could communicate with all the other dialysis units. So within Turkey, we could actually send the dialyzers, sets, and also volunteer nurses, dialysis nurses, technicians, as well as young nephrologists who went to the area to actually take care of the patients. This is also very important because at times of disasters, the people, the health staff working in the area are also the victims of the disaster, and they have their own families to take care of. They themselves have been traumatized. So it's very important to take over and to let them recover. So we also had a plan for that, and we had a lot of volunteer people from within Turkey going to the area to work for a week and then rotate. So all this comes with a logistic planning, and it's a very sad, tragic situation. But I'm happy to say that as the nephrology community, I think we didn't do too bad. You've given the numbers for the pediatric patients. We estimated to have about 1,500 crush patients, and which was the case in fact, and we tried to collect the data on them. So we had data on about 1,000 patients. And I can say that about 70% had acute kidney injury. Again, 70% of those with acute kidney injury required dialysis. So that's indeed a large number of patients requiring dialysis at a specific point.
So you're talking about adult patients now?
Adult patients, yes.
1,500 crush adult victims, right? And,
probably, yes.
And about 70% needed dialysis.
Exactly.
Yeah. I mean,
but we couldn't collect data on all 1,500. We only had data on 1,000 patients.
I mean, this is a very important thing. I mean, it's great that you nephrologists in Turkey are able to gather all this data because, you know, when a disaster happens, research is the last thing you think about. But without knowing the numbers, you don't know how to prepare for it. So I'm very happy that you've been able to provide all of us with the data on the scope of the problem. And I guess the key thing that you've mentioned here is this well-established network that can identify the scope of the problem, which dialysis unit is not working, and so on. So you've described beautifully how your system works. And I guess one thing that I think you do as well is to educate the paramedics about the correct treatment of crush, because that can be very important, right?
Indeed. And again, you know, through the years, we had other earthquakes, perhaps not as severe as the last one, but others. And we had the chance to put into action, and we saw that over the years, in Marmara earthquake, for example, there were still patients coming to the hospital without any IV fluids,
Yeah.
or with IV fluids containing potassium.
Yeah.
Now, through the years, everybody arrives at the hospital with an IV line in, and many are being treated while the extrication process is continued. Plus, there was no one arriving to the hospital receiving fluids, receiving potassium-containing fluids. So obviously, education helps. Unforgotten knowledge is forgotten. Unused knowledge is forgotten. For which reason we need to repeat these educational activities.
Yes, I heard that the paramedics do the IV line as soon as a hand is available, right?
Indeed,
yeah,
indeed.
which sounds extreme, but it helps. So if we want to be prepared, how do we learn more about disaster nephrology? Because most of us have not learned about it a lot. We don't have a course in school or maybe even in the residency, a part of the residency that we would devote to that. So how can we learn more about disaster nephrology? Where can we look that up?
Andre, I would just like to mention here, until I think 1988, when there was the Armenian earthquake, that was one of the biggest major earthquakes. There was no term as renal disaster or disaster nephrology.
Yep.
It was the first time when Norbert Lamer, I think, first used this term, renal disaster, because during the Armenian earthquake, there wasn't enough dialysis machines. So most patients with CRASH syndrome unfortunately died due to lack of dialysis. Hence the term renal disaster. I mean, not a heart disaster, not a liver disaster, but a renal disaster. Now, following this, of course, through the years, we learned that it is not the CRASH syndrome following the earthquakes, which is the only disaster that we see. There are now many other disasters. There are floods, climate, disaster related to climate change, droughts also, but also, as you well know, man-made disasters, industrial accidents or armed conflicts. The world is kind of, boiling now everywhere. So obviously, it's not only the CRASH syndrome patients anymore, but also chronic kidney disease patients. So the term disaster nephrology has been started to be used to encompass all this spectrum. So through the years, there has been many papers published, especially by the names that I've given already. And there has been an accumulation of knowledge, really. But there has been guidelines for the treatment of CRASH syndrome. But also recently, there is a chapter now on disaster nephrology in ENF manual. It's an educational initiative of ERA, European Renal Association, freely accessible to all members. So I would suggest to go and, have a look at that. And it will be updated regularly. And we'll be very happy with the feedback, of course.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for explaining all of this so very clearly. So ERA has now a disaster relief task force. This will probably stay because the world is boiling, as you say. So how do you see the future of these task forces developing? How do you see what the future will be? We're probably hoping that more and more people will be aware of this problem and perhaps even participate in these task forces.
Indeed. As Andreas, you have mentioned the Kidney Relief Disaster Task Force of ERA. was first started after the war in Ukraine, aiming to reach out to the nephrology community and patients with kidney disease in Ukraine. And you were also a member of the task force, of that task force as well. And now things seem to be more stable in Ukraine from kidney patients' perspective. Let me emphasize that. But we saw that this humanitarian response is needed. And we gathered a know-how to communicate, to how to communicate with the network, our network with all the stakeholders, especially the NGOs, WHO, nurses associations, patients associations, but also the industry, both pharmaceutical industry and dialysis industry. And we learned that we should all be working together. So this is a kind of a responsibility of all of us, really. And now, having realized this, now there is the kidney relief task force by ERA, which there was an open call recently, and the new task force has just been approved and will shortly be announced, I think. And I'm happy to say that there were many applicants to this task force. Obviously, unused information is easily forgotten. Therefore, organizing perhaps educational activities will be in their agenda. And I also value local task forces a lot. Each region may have a different natural threat or a threat for armed conflict. So local planning ahead in disaster-free periods is important. So I would really ask everybody, to look at it from their own region point of view as well. But obviously, international collaboration helps for networking and reaching out. I'm also happy to say that the three major nephrology societies, ISN, ASN, and ERA, have come to a memorandum of understanding to collaborate at times of disasters, which is a very important step forward. So I think in the coming days, months, we will hear more about work in this area.
Okay, thank you. You've shared a lot of messages, important ones, and I'm sure we'll have to digest all of this and act locally. Like you said, local situations can be different. We had a major flood last year, and that's a different situation, but also a challenge for dialysis patients as well. So before we end, if you had only like one message to give a younger nephrologist in terms of disaster nephrology or in general, what would your suggestion, or what would your message be for our younger colleagues that are starting off in nephrology?
Well, I would suggest that they be really open-minded, be interested, be passionate, and communicate with colleagues from all over the world, really. Follow the activities in the nephrology community. I personally feel very privileged to be part of the nephrology community, and I hope that upcoming young nephrologists really share the same privilege.
Sometimes we're very closed up in our own spaces, and we don't really realize the benefits we might have by collaborating, right? I agree with that, yeah. Okay, so the last question, which is like a getting to know you question, is which book, 2 songs, and luxury item would you take to a desert island, Serhan?
Yes, well, I think I find this the most difficult question. It's difficult
Many do, many do, yeah.
I think I thought about this. I knew this question would be coming, having listened to the other podcasts as well. I really love reading books. Some authors that I have, had the chance to read in the last few years and whose work I truly enjoyed were Ian McEwan from UK, and also there is Adichie Chimamanda Adichie from Nigeria. I would like to read their novels, other novels. So I would like to go with a pile of books for you, not
Okay,
too
fair enough. We'll accept that. Yeah.
Thank you.
I've never heard about the
Uh,
lady from Africa, so I'm happy that you mentioned her.
Yes, Half of a Yellow Sun was the one that I really enjoyed reading. So again, you know, I love listening to the music, and I thought about it, you know, when I really think I like, you know, listening to Elton John and Patricia Cass. So I would also, you know, they make me happy.
Okay.
For the luxury item, I'm not sure if it would be considered a luxury item, but I would like to have a bike to go around the island.
Yeah, that works. That works.
And if I may, I would like to take my dog with me. I mean, it's not a luxury item, but she's like the joy of my life. So
Oh
I'd
yeah.
like to be accompanied.
Yeah, I've only had a dog for two years now, and I've never imagined it to be such a nice thing. I've never had
Yeah.
a dog before. All right, Serhan, thank you very much. You've offered a lot of insight, valuable insight, I think, for our listeners to think about. And dear listeners, thank you for listening in. And Serhan, have a great summer in Turkey. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye. Thank you, Andrej.